The steward put his hand flat against the door of the great house and told the young woman on the steps that there was no work at Thornwood Manor for anyone named Callister, not this winter and not any winter after it, and that she would oblige him by being off the drive before the family looked out and saw her standing there. Wren Callister did not move. She was 23 that January, thin from a bad year, dark hair pinned under a gray bonnet that had been relined twice, and she had walked 11 miles since dawn with a bundle on her back and a dented tin box under her arm. Snow had got into her left boot at the 5th mile and had never got out again. She looked past the steward's shoulder into the warm, brown dark of the hall, at the fire burning at the end of it for nobody at all, and she said that she had come about the still room. The steward's name was Frayne. He had been in that house 26 years, and he had a way of ending a conversation with his eyebrows. He said the position was filled. She said the notice was pasted in the post office window in the village that morning, and the paste was still wet, and it said still room maid, £16 the year, apply at the house. He said it was filled. She said that he might take the notice down, then, because there were 4 other girls in that village reading it in the cold. Above them, a sash went up. The voice that came out of the window did not hurry and did not rise. It said, "Give her the still room." Frayne turned his head so slowly that Wren heard his collar move. He said, "Your Grace," and nothing else, because there was nothing else in 26 years of service that fitted the shape of that moment. The sash came down. The Duke of Thornwood had spoken 11 words to his household that day, and 5 of them had just ruined the steward's morning. Here is the thing you should hold on to, because the house held on to it for the next 5 months and could not put it down. 19 months before that January, the master of that house had signed a paper dismissing Silas Callister, bee master, without a character, and had ordered every hive on the estate burned in the yard where the men could see it, and had forbidden honey to be brought through his doors in any form, in any dish, on any plate, for any reason. He had signed the paper in his own hand, at his own desk, on the 6th of June, 1869, 2 days after his wife died at the breakfast table. And now he had put the dead man's daughter in his still room, and he had not explained himself, and no one in that house was fool enough to ask him. Frayne took her round to the servants' entrance the long way, across the frozen gravel, past the stable arch, and he did not carry her bundle. The kitchen court smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. At the door he stopped and told her, without turning, that she would keep to the still room and the back passage, that she would not go into the gardens, that she would not go near the south drive, and that she would not speak of her father in his hearing or in anyone else's. Wren said she would keep to the still room. She did not agree to the rest, and he did not notice, because he had never in his life listened to the second half of anything a servant said. The housekeeper was Mrs. Ledgard, 60 years old, with a bunch of keys at her waist that weighed as much as a hen, and a face that had been kind before it had been careful. She looked at Wren for a long moment in the passage, at the wet boots and the tin box, and she said, "Oh, child," not unkindly, the way you say it when you have watched a thing coming up the road for a mile and can do nothing about the fact that it has arrived. She gave her a bed in the room over the scullery, a candle, a print dress, and one piece of advice, which was that in this house there was a word they did not say, and that Wren would find it easier than most to guess which one, and harder than most to keep off her tongue. Then she said supper was at 8, and that she would be at the table with the rest of them, and that she should eat, because she looked as though she had not. The servants' hall at 8 held 14 people and 1 silence. Wren came in and sat where Mrs. Ledgard's hand pointed, And the talk did not stop the way it does in stories. It went on. It went on very brightly, about the frost and the mare and the price of coal at the wharf, and about everything in the world except the girl at the end of the bench, and that was worse than stopping. A housemaid named Nance passed the bread to the left rather than pass it to the right, and put it in Wren's hand at the end of the ark, as though it had got there by weather. Down the table a young footman named Gower looked at Wren once, quickly, the way you look at a dog you are not sure of, and then looked at his plate for the rest of the meal, and ate almost nothing. She noticed that. She had a year of noticing behind her by then, and it had made her exact. Her father had been dead 12 months and 2 days. He had died on the 14th of January, 1870, in a rented room over the saddler's shop in the village. Of a cough that started in the wet autumn and got into his chest and stayed there. And Dr. Merrick had come twice and had been paid neither time. What Silas Callister left behind him was this: a tin box of 41 years of bee journals, written in pencil, in a hand that pressed so hard the letters had a shadow on the next page. 11 pounds and 4 shillings of debt, which is a number Wren could say in her sleep by then, because she had said it to the saddler, and to Merrick's clerk, and to the man at the shop, and to her aunt. A boy of 11, named Bram, her brother, who had been sent to a lime kiln at Hexwell to earn his keep, because their aunt had 6 of her own and a leaking roof and no room in her for another mouth or another opinion, and a name that could not be said in 3 parishes without somebody's face changing. That was the estate of Silas Callister, bee-master of Thornwood Manor, 9 years in the place, who had loved his bees the way some men love God, quietly and without expecting to be thanked, and who had died being called the man who poisoned a duchess. The still room at the manor was a long, cold room on the north side, with a stone sink, a copper, a wall of shelves, and a window that gave onto the kitchen court and the stable arch. It had been left to a girl who left, and to a girl after her who did not care, and it smelled of old vinegar and mice. On her first morning Wren found 19 jars of black currant jelly gone to sugar, a shelf of tinctures with their labels fallen off, and a stone crock of last year's rosehip syrup with a green skin on it 2 fingers thick. By the end of the first week the room smelled of scalded copper and clove, and every jar on the wall had a paper collar on it, with the month and the year written out in pencil in a hand that pressed hard enough to leave a shadow. Mrs. Ledgard came in on the Friday, put her finger inside the rim of the sink, looked at her finger, and said nothing, which in that house was a testimonial. The rules of the place were not written anywhere. Wren collected them by barking her shins on them. The blue drawing room was shut, and had been shut since the June before last, and the girls dusted it once a month, with the shutters closed. The mistress's rooms on the first floor were locked, and Mrs. Ledgard carried that key separately from the others, on a ribbon, not on the ring. Nobody walked on the south drive. The gardeners went round by the paddock rather than past the bee house, which stood at the top of the kitchen garden with 2 boards nailed across its door in an X, and which the men called nothing at all, because they had stopped needing a word for a place they never went. And there was no honey in that house, not in the kitchen, not in the still room, not in a cough mixture, not in a glaze on a ham, not in the nursery. The cook made her seed cake with treacle and her almonds with sugar syrup, and had done for 19 months, and had stopped noticing that this was strange. When a Christmas hamper came up from a tenant with a jar of it in the straw, the jar went into the fire without being unwrapped, and the tenant got a very polite letter. Wren learned that from Nance, who told her at the table with her chin up, watching to see what her face would do. Her face did not do anything. She had been braced for that particular blow since the post office window. It came, and it landed, and she went on eating her supper, and Nance was disappointed. And that was the first small ground Wren took in that house without anyone noticing it had been taken. The child she saw on the fourth day. There was a window on the first floor above the kitchen court, the third from the arch, and there was a face in it at 3:30 in the afternoon when the light went, and it was there again the next day, and the next. A little girl of 6, with her mother's yellow hair and her father's stillness, kneeling on a window seat with her chin on the sill, looking down at a courtyard where nothing whatever happened. Her name was Honor. Wren learned that from the nursery maid, who came down for the child's milk and stayed 9 minutes complaining, and who said the child would not eat, that she would not eat anything at all with a spoon and hardly anything with a fork, that she had been like it more than a year, and that the doctor had been 3 times and said she was well and would grow out of it, and that His Grace would not have her taken to the sea because He would not have her taken anywhere. Wren asked whether the child went into the gardens. The nursery maid looked at her as though she had asked whether the child went to Peru. She said, "Into the gardens." She said, "His Grace does not have her out of doors on that side of the house at all," and left with the milk. And the Duke. Wren had not seen him yet, only heard 11 words of him through a window, and then on the 9th day she came round the corner of the stable arch with a basket of sloes, and he was standing in the middle of the kitchen court in the dark at 6 in the morning in his shirt sleeves in 12 degrees of frost, doing nothing. Hallam Ravensworth, 4th of that name to hold the place, was 32 years old, tall, black-haired, with a face that had been handsome in a photograph on the mantel and was now a set of hard, flat planes, with the light gone out behind them. He was looking at the top of the kitchen garden, at the little dark shape of the bee house with the boards across its door. He had a lamp in his hand that he had not lit. He did not hear her. She stood in the arch with the basket on her hip, and she did not go forward, and she did not go back. And after a while he turned and went in through the gun-room door without seeing her at all, and she stood there long enough for her hands to hurt. In the village they said he had gone hard. They said it with a certain satisfaction, in the way of people who have been told all their lives that the big house is a different sort of world, and are pleased when it turns out to be worse. They said he had not been to the county dinner in 2 years, nor to church except at Christmas, standing at the end of the family pew with the whole row empty beside him. They said the young Duchess had died at her own birthday breakfast in 1869, with the whole table watching, 28 years old, and that the Duke had burned every hive on the place that same week in the stable yard, with the men standing round it. 8 of them, 60,000 bees to a hive, and that you could hear it from the road. Wren had been standing on the road. She was 21 then, and she had come up to bring her father his dinner. And she had got to the gate as the smoke went up, and she had stood there and watched her father watch it, and neither of them had said anything, and they had walked home. Nobody in the village ever mentioned that part, that there had been 2 people on the road. They mentioned the burning, because the burning made a good story, and a good story is a thing that has no one standing at the edge of it in the cold. She asked Frayne for her father's things on the 2nd Tuesday, in the passage outside the muniment room, standing straight with her hands at her sides the way you stand when you have practiced a sentence on the stairs. She said her father had kept his tools and his books in the bee house, and that he had gone out of this place in November 1869 with what he could carry, and that she would like what was left, and that she would take it in her own time and out of her own hours. Frayne said the bee house was closed. She said she knew it was closed. He said it was closed by His Grace's order and would stay closed, and that if she raised the matter again she would be out of the house by the evening, and that she might reflect on how few doors in that county would open to her afterwards. Then he said the thing he had been carrying up the passage in his mouth all week, which was that she should be grateful she had a roof, considering. Wren said. Considering what? It is a small sentence. She said it very quietly, and she did not blink, and Frayne, who had 26 years and a set of keys and every advantage a man can have in a corridor, discovered that he did not want to finish his own sentence out loud, and went into the muniment room and shut the door. That night she went up the kitchen garden in the dark. The moon was 3 days off full, and the frost had put a shine on the top of the wall. The bee house was a little stone building with a slate roof and a chimney it had never used. And behind it, where the hive row had been, the ground was still bare and black in 8 rectangles. Because when you burn a hive in the place it stands, the earth remembers it for years. She stood in front of the boards a long time. Then she took the fire iron she had brought under her cloak, and she put the flat of it under the lower board, and she leaned. The nail came up with a noise like a cat. The second board took longer, and the door had swelled, and she had to lift it on its hinge to get it in, and then she was standing inside a room that had been shut for 19 months, in the smell of old wax and cold soot and mouse, and every single thing in it was exactly where her father had left it on the morning of the 4th of June, 1869. His apron on the peg. The smoker on the bench with the bellows cracked. 3 straw skeps stacked in the corner. The veil hanging over the back of the chair with the wire gone rusty and the shape of his head still in the crown of it. She put her hand on the apron and stood with it in her fist and made no sound at all. Because the still room window was 200 yards away and sound goes a long way over frost. The tin box was under the bench where it always lived, and the mice had been at the corner of it, and inside were the journals. 41 years of them, 16 little books with marbled boards, and a paper cover for the last one because the money had been short. She was on her knees with the 4th of them open on the bench, and the lantern turned low when the door moved behind her. She did not turn round. She said, "I have not taken anything out of this room, and I will not." There was no answer for long enough that she stopped breathing. Then the lantern light went up on the wall as he lifted his own, and the Duke of Thornwood said, "That is his hand." Wren turned round. He was standing in the doorway in a black coat with the collar up and no hat, and he was not looking at her at all. He was looking at the open book on the bench, at the pencil letters going hard across the paper, and his face had come apart in a way she had not been prepared for. Because she had spent a year building a man out of a signature and a smoke column, and the man in the doorway did not fit the drawing. He said, "What is it?" She said, "The journals." He said, "Of what?" She said, "Of everything, of the weather and the flow and the swarms and what the bees worked and when they worked it, every day. From 1829, when he was 9 years old and kept his first skep in a hedge, until the 2nd of June, 1869. He came in. He put the lantern on the bench, and he stood over the open page and read a line of it, and she watched him read it. And she saw the exact half-second when he understood that he was in a room he had been walking past for 19 months, and that everything in it had been sitting there the whole time with its mouth open. He said, "Why did you break the boards?" She said, "Because you nailed my father inside a shed and told the county he was a murderer. And then You gave me a bed and 16 pounds a year. And I have been trying since the 16th of January to understand what kind of man does both, and I am not going to understand it standing in a still room. That was the first time anyone had spoken to Hallam Ravensworth like that since his wife died. It landed somewhere in the middle of him. He put his hand on the bench and looked at the wall for a while. And then he said, in a voice that had no rank in it at all, "Get out of the cold." And she said no, and he said, "At least take the box in with you then," and went out of the door, and she stood there with her heart going like a bird in a chimney, holding a tin of pencil books, listening to the gravel take him away. He did not have the boards re-nailed. That is how they knew downstairs that something had shifted. On the Thursday, the 2 boards were still lying in the frost where she had dropped them, and Frayne walked up the kitchen garden and looked at them, and walked back down. And by supper 14 people at a table had adjusted their idea of the shape of the world without a single one of them saying so. She read the journals at night in the room over the scullery, with the candle propped in a jar so the draught would not have it, and she read them in order. Because her father had done everything in order, and she was not going to insult him now. They were not sentimental books. They were a ledger of weather and work. 3rd of April. Wind north, no flying. 9th of April, willow out, 6 frames. 11th of May, cold, fed the far row a pint of syrup each, they will not forgive me. And every year, every single year, from 1862 when he came to the place, in the same week of June, the same instruction, written to nobody but himself. Cut the spring calm off the near row and burn it. Do not let it go to the house. Do not let it go to the men. It is off the purple. In 1864 he had written it, and then written under it, "They will say it is waste again." In 1866, the steward asked why. I said, because I say. In 1867, burnt 11 pounds of it in the ash pit. A shame, a shame. But there is no arguing with a flower. Wren sat with the book open on her knees and the candle going, and she read that line 4 times. She was a bee-master's daughter. She had known since she was small that there were flowers you did not let a hive keep, the way there are berries you do not put in a pie. And she had known that the near row at the manor was never taken before the lime was out, and she had never once in her life asked why. Because when you are 8 years old and your father says a thing is so, it is so. And by the time you are old enough to ask, you have stopped noticing there is a question. The purple was the South Drive. 300 bushes of it, going up both sides for half a mile, glossy and dark all winter and covered in June in flowers the color of a bruise. The 4th Duke had brought them in 1851 from a nursery in Devon, because every great house in England was planting them that decade for the cover they gave the pheasants, and because the 4th Duke did not intend to be the last man in the county to have a thing. Wren had walked under them 100 times. Every bee on that estate had worked them. And in a good spring it did not matter, because in a good spring there was fruit blossom, and there was clover, and there was the hawthorn and the sycamore and the moor coming on behind, and a hive with 100 fields to choose from does not sit all day on a bush that is bad for it. In a bad spring, in a late spring, in a spring where the frost has taken the blossom off the orchards in a night, and the clover is 3 weeks behind, and the moor is a brown lie, a hive will work whatever is open, and the purple is always open. Her father had written it in 1862 in his 2nd week in the place, when he walked the drive and saw what the 4th Duke had planted, and he had written 1 word after it. Careful, she turned the page. There was nothing on the 4th of June, 1869, because on the 4th of June, 1869, Silas Callister was lying in his cottage on his 3rd week of pleurisy, coughing into a bowl, and the last entry in the book, in a hand that had gone loose and slanted, was the 2nd of June, and it said, "Cannot rise. Tell F. not to take the near row." She read that at 10 minutes past 1 in the morning on the 28th of January, 1871, in a room over a scullery, with her father 11 months in the ground, and she put her hand over her mouth and she sat perfectly still for a very long time. Then she got up and put the book in the tin and put the tin under the mattress and lay down in her clothes and did not sleep at all. She did not have anything yet. She had a dead man's pencil telling a steward not to do a thing, and no proof on God's earth that the steward had gone and done it. But there is a difference between a house that is heavy and a house that is lying, and she had just felt the floor move under her, and after that night she was not a girl earning £16 a year in a still room. She was something else, and she was patient, and she had all spring. They had let her father keep the cottage until Michaelmas, the 29th of September, out of what Frayne wrote in the daybook as consideration, and out of what everyone else understood to be the fact that turning a sick man onto the road in June while the county was still talking would have looked worse than the alternative. He was out in November, 6 weeks in a room over the Saddlers, and then the cough came up through the floor of him and took him out of the world on the 14th of January. The child came down to the still room on the 2nd of February. Wren turned round from the copper, and there was a small person in the doorway in a white pinafore, holding the door frame with both hands, looking at the shelf of jars with an expression of enormous and unforgivable interest. Wren did not say hello. She had a theory about children that she had got from bees, which is that anything frightened does not want to be greeted. It wants to be ignored in a friendly manner until it is decided about you. So she turned back to the copper and went on stirring, and after a while she said to the copper that the little one at the end was quince, and the one next to it was quince as well, but from a different tree, and it never set properly, and she did not know why. Honor Ravensworth said, "Why are they different colors?" Wren said, "Because one tree is by the wall and one is not." That was the whole conversation. The child stood there 9 or 10 minutes and then went away, and came back the next day, and the day after that. On the 4th day she got up on the stool without being asked. On the 6th she was allowed to hold the funnel. On the 9th of February she said, with her chin on the bench and her eyes on the jar, that she was not allowed in the garden. And Wren said, "I know." And the child said, "Why?" And Wren, who had 100 answers ready and was not going to use a single one of them on a 6-year-old, said, "I do not know. Ask your father." And the child looked at her with her mother's yellow hair falling in her face and said, "We do not ask him things." The child would not eat. Wren watched it for 3 weeks before she understood it, and she only understood it because of a spoon. It was the last day of February, and there was a bowl of bread and milk on the still room bench for the child's dinner, sent down by the nursery maid because the child would take it there and would not take it upstairs, and Wren put the spoon in the bowl and pushed it 6 inches across the wood, and Honor Ravensworth went backwards off the stool so fast she knocked it over. She stood against the wall with her hands behind her and her breath going high and fast, staring at the bowl, at a bowl of bread and milk, in a still room, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Wren did not go to her. She took the spoon out of the bowl and put it in her apron pocket, and she broke a piece of the bread off with her fingers and ate it herself, slowly, looking out of the window at the stable arch, and after 4 or 5 minutes, the child came off the wall and stood at her elbow and put her hand out for a piece, and ate it out of her own fingers, and then another. She ate half the loaf that way. She was starving. She had been starving for a year and 8 months in a house with a French cook and 11 servants. That night, Wren went to the nursery maid and asked one question, which was whether the child had been at the table on the morning her mother died. And the nursery maid, who was 19 and had not been in the place then and had never been told and had never asked, said she did not know, and looked frightened, and went away. So Wren asked Mrs. Ledgard in the passage at 10 at night, with the keys hanging still on the woman's belt and the whole house asleep above them. And Mrs. Ledgard sat down on the bench outside the linen room, which Wren had never seen her do, and put her hands flat on her knees and looked at the wall for a while, and then she said yes. She said it was her Grace's birthday, and she was 28, and the child was brought down for it as a treat, because she had been asking all the week to have breakfast with the grown people. She said she was 4.5 years old, and she sat on 2 cushions on her mother's right hand. And Mrs. Ledgard stopped and started again and said, the comb came in on the blue plate, and her Grace took it on the spoon, because it was her birthday and it was her own hives, and she was pleased about it. And she said something about the taste, and inside 20 minutes she was on the floor, and the child was under the table the whole while, and nobody got her out for an hour and a half, because there was not one person in that room with a hand to spare. Wren said, and after. Mrs. Ledgard said after, His Grace could not look at her, not for weeks. She said it flatly, without excusing him. She said, and I will tell you what nobody in this house will tell you, because I have been here since he was a boy, and I am too old for it now. That child has not eaten a thing off a spoon since the 4th of June, 1869, and there is not one soul under this roof who has ever once said out loud why that might be, because to say why you would have to say the whole of it, and there is a rule. And the doctor comes and looks in her throat, and the father cannot go into the room, and the steward writes in his book that the nursery is quiet, and the girl is 4 years old, and then she is 5 years old, and then she is 6, and she sits in a window and watches an empty yard. She said, I have carried that for 19 months. Then she picked up her keys and stood up and said, in her ordinary voice, that the copper wanted scouring, and went to bed. 19 months of perfectly correct behavior had produced this. The fires lit, the silver counted, the clocks wound, the shutters closed on the right room, on the right Tuesday of the month, and a girl of 6 sitting in a window in the middle of it, who had never once been told, in plain words, what it was that she had watched from under a table. Every person under that roof had agreed to it one small silence at a time, and not one of them had ever meant to. In March she began to plan. She did it the way her father did everything, which was slowly, in pencil, and with the weather. She wanted a swarm. There were no bees on that estate. 8 hives burned in a yard leave nothing behind them but bare ground, and the nearest kept bees were 4 miles off at the vicarage, and the vicar, the Reverend Oakhurst, was a mild, round man of 70 who had buried her father and had refused to take the fee, and had never once, in the pulpit or out of it, used the word that the village used. She walked over to see him on her Sunday afternoon and asked whether she might have the first swarm off the 2 skeps in his orchard. And the Reverend Oakhurst, who had been in that parish 40 years and had a very good idea of what he was being asked and by whom and for where, took his spectacles off and cleaned them for rather a long time and put them back on, and said that the first swarm of the year was hers, and that he hoped it would be a May one, because there is a rhyme about that, and she said she knew the rhyme. And he said, so did your father. And that was all either of them said about it. On the way back over the moor, she said her father's name out loud, once to nothing, because it had been 14 months since she had heard anybody say it in a voice that was not lowered, and she found that she had forgotten the sound of it in an ordinary tone. The carriage came on the 11th of March, and it changed the temperature of the house in about 4 minutes. The Countess of Marchmore was a handsome woman of 51, who had been at school with the Duke's mother, and who had decided, some time around the second winter, that grief was a thing that had been allowed to go on for quite long enough in a house with 11,000 acres attached to it. She came with her daughter. Lady Adeline Sedge was 24, fair, very well made, with a low, pleasant voice and the sort of manners you cannot buy in one generation. And she was not a fool, and she was not a cat. And it is important that you understand that, because it would be easier if she were. She had been half promised to Hallam Ravensworth when she was 15, and he was 23, in the loose way that great families half promise things. And then he had gone and married a girl from a smaller house out of nothing but liking, and Adeline had waited it out for 9 years with more grace than most women could manage. And now the wife was in the chapel vault, and the county had a view. The county's view was that it had been 19 months, that there was a child who needed a mother, that the estate needed an heir, and that everything about the arrangement was so tidy it very nearly hummed. The Countess brought the plan into the house the way you bring in a dog, saying it was no trouble and letting it get into every room. There would be a reception. The house would be opened for the first time since the death, the blue drawing room and all, and it would be on the 9th of June, and there would be 42 people to dinner, and the county would come and look at the master of Thornwood standing on his own staircase like a living man, and everybody understood without a syllable being spoken what else would be said on that staircase before the evening was over. Frayne was given the ordering of it and came alive like a plant in water. The shutters came off the blue drawing room. Men came from Newcastle about the chandelier. And downstairs, in a passage, on the 14th of March, Lady Adeline Sedge stopped in front of the still room door, because she had heard something, and looked in, and saw a still room maid with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, lifting a small girl down off a stool. And the small girl was talking. Adeline stood there for a moment with her hand on the frame. Then she asked, pleasantly, who the young woman was. And Nance, who was passing with an armful of linen and who had been waiting 3 months for a chance exactly this size, said, "That is the beekeeper's daughter, my lady, the one whose father did it." If you want to know how a county that said that sentence in March ended up standing in a bee house in June with their hats in their hands, stay with me, and if this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe, and we will go on. The Countess had her out of the house by Friday. Or she would have, if it had been her house. She went to the Duke in the library on the 16th, and she was not cruel about it, which was the strange part. She said what any sensible woman of 51 would say, which was that the girl had a claim on his conscience, and that a claim on the conscience is a thing you settle with money, not with a bed in your own attic. She said, give her £20 and a character, and send her to a place in York where nobody has heard the name, and you will have done more for her than keeping her here where every soul in the servants' hall knows what her father was. She said, Hallam, she is a reminder, and you cannot mend a thing by keeping the reminder in the house. And the Duke of Thornwood stood at his own window with his back to her for a while, and then he said, no, not a speech. No, and the Countess, who had known him since he was in a sailor suit, understood 2 things there in the library, one of which was that she was not going to win this argument, and the other of which she did not put a name to for another 11 weeks. It got worse after that, in the way things get worse without anybody doing anything. The house had a story now, and the story had a shape. On the road to church, the village had it. At the dinner table at Marchmore, they had it. She has got into that house. She has got round him. The father poisons the Duchess, and the daughter walks up the drive and takes the dead woman's kitchen. And now she has her hands on the child, and where is that going to end? Wren heard it in the shop when she went down for the lemons. She heard a woman she had known all her life stop talking when she came in, and start again, brightly, about the price of coal. Nance was the worst of it and the smallest. Salt in a jar, the still room window left open on a night with the fire out and 40 pounds of preserves down the wall in the morning. Nothing you could take to a housekeeper without sounding like a child. Wren cleaned it up and said nothing, and wrote the date on the back of a label, and that is the whole of what she did about Nance for 3 months. And on the 3rd of April the Duke came to the still room door himself at 9 in the evening, which had never happened, and stood there like a man who had walked into the wrong room in his own house, and said that he understood the child was eating. Wren said she was. She said, with her fingers, off the bench, standing up, and she would take bread, and she would take fruit, and she would take cold meat, and she would take nothing whatever off a spoon. And she has not, since the 4th of June, 1869, and I think you know why, Your Grace, and I think you have known for a year and 8 months, and have not been able to put it in a sentence. So I am going to put it in one for you. Her mother died in front of her, off a spoon. The Duke of Thornwood put his hand out and held the door frame. He did not go away. That was the thing she had not counted on. She had built a man who went away. He came in and sat down on the stool the child sat on, which put a duke about level with a copper, and he said, "Tell me how you know." So she told him. The bowl, the spoon, the 6 inches of bench, the girl going backwards off the stool, the half-loaf eaten out of her fingers looking at the window. And when she had finished, he sat there with his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor of a still room for a while. And then he said, "I have not been able to say her name in this house since the 6th of June. Not to the child. Not to anyone." Wren said, "Elspeth." He made a sound. She said it again, not cruelly, the way you would put a plate down in front of somebody who has not eaten. She said, "Elspeth Ravensworth, who was 28, and who kept 8 hives and knew every one of them, and who used to come up the kitchen garden in a straw hat with no veil on, and my father used to tell her off for it, and she never once minded, and who was the only person in this house who ever asked him a question about bees and waited for the answer." She said, "I knew her. Did you know that? I was 11 years old when she came here as a bride, and she gave me a ribbon at the harvest supper, and I have got it still." And the Duke of Thornwood put his hands over his face in front of a servant, and Wren Callister stood in the middle of her still room with a copper going behind her, and let him, and did not say one word of comfort, because she had not come there to comfort him, and because there are moments where the kindest thing in the world is to stand still and not look away. When he had done, he said, "Sit down." She sat on the flour bin, and he told her about the 4th of June, 1869, all of it, in order, for the first time out loud in his life. He said there had been 11 at the table because it was her birthday. He said the comb came in on the blue Worcester plate, the deep one, and everybody said the thing everybody says, that it was her own bees, and she was pleased. And she took the spoon and had a good piece of it, and she said, "It is sharp," and laughed, and said it was the more coming into it. He said he had a piece himself. Wren said what? He did not hear her. He was in the room. He said the cousin had some, and the parson's wife would not have any because of her teeth. And Frayne had brought it in himself, which he had not thought about in 19 months, and had no idea why he had just said. He said that inside a quarter of an hour Elspeth had gone grey, and said the room was going round, and stood up, and sat down, and then went off the chair sideways and hit the corner of the table. And that Merrick was 35 minutes coming, and by then she was cold to the wrist, and her pulse was so slow he could not find it at all, and she was gone by 9 that evening without saying anything more than his name. Twice, he said, and the cousin was sick in the hall. He said, and I was ill myself that night and thought it was the shock. Wren said, Your Grace. Say the other part again. He looked up. She said, You had a piece of it. Say what it did. And Hallam Ravensworth sat on a stool in a still room at 10 o'clock at night on the 3rd of April, 1871, and went back down into the worst morning of his life and found something in it that he had walked past 1,000 times, and his face changed, and he said, slowly, like a man reading a language he learned as a boy, My mouth went numb, he said, my tongue and my lips for an hour, perhaps 2. I could not feel the cup. He said, I thought it was fear. He said, I have thought that for 19 months. It was very quiet in the still room. Wren said, My father's hand was under your gate for 9 years, and you never once had a doctor look at it. Then she said, No, that is not what I meant. And she got up and walked to the window and stood there with her back to a duke and her hands flat on the sill and made herself breathe. Because you cannot say to a man on the strength of one numb mouth that his wife was killed by his father's flower bed. You cannot say it on a stool at 10 at night with no proof and a still-room maid's word and a dead man's pencil. You will get one hearing in your life on a thing like that. She had learned that from watching her father get his one hearing on a June afternoon in a library with a steward at his elbow, and lose it, and never get another. So she stood at the window and she made herself wait, and she said, When the bees come back, I will tell you a thing. And he said, What bees? And she said, That is my business until May. And she heard him get up, and she did not turn round, and at the door he stopped and said, Thank you for saying her name, and went out, and she stood at that window with her heart going until the candle was down to the jar. The swarm came on the 19th of May, which is the best kind of luck there is, because a swarm in May is worth a load of hay, and a swarm in July is not worth a fly, and every child in that county could say it before they could read. The vicarage boy ran the 4 miles and came into the kitchen court at 11:30 in the morning with his cap in his hand, and Wren went out through the arch at a speed that made the cook put her head out of the window. She had the skep ready. It was one of her father's, rye straw, bound with bramble, 22 years old and as sound as the day he sewed it, and she had rubbed the inside of it with balm and dried it in the sun for a fortnight. The swarm was in the vicarage orchard on the low branch of a bullace, hanging in a shape like a beard, about 4 pounds of bees, and the Reverend Oakhurst was standing well back in his shirt sleeves with an expression of pure delight, and his gardener was up a ladder doing nothing very slowly. Wren put the skep on the grass on a sheet. She did not put on a veil. She reached up with both bare hands and took hold of the branch, and she gave it one sharp shake. 1, and the whole 4 pounds of them came off it in a lump and fell into the straw with a noise like a bag of grain, and she set the skep down at an angle with a stone under the rim, and stood back, and inside of 90 seconds there were 300 bees standing on the lip of it with their tails in the air, fanning, calling the rest in. The Reverend Oakhurst said, well, he said it twice. Then he said, your father did that in this orchard in 1864 with a colander, and turned away and blew his nose for quite a long time. She carried them home at dusk with the sheet tied over the skep and every bee in it roaring at her hip the whole 4 miles, and she put them on the bare black rectangle at the end of the row where the second hive had stood, on a stand her father had made. And she stood there in the dark with her arms shaking and looked at the manor, at the big lit window on the first floor, the third from the arch. She got the child out the next morning. She did not ask anybody. She went up the back stair at 7, and she said, put your shoes on, and the nursery maid opened her mouth and Wren looked at her, and she shut it. They went down through the kitchen court and up the kitchen garden in the wet, and Honor Ravensworth stopped dead at the top of the path, because she had not been in a garden in her memory, and the sun was coming over the wall, and there was a straw hive on a stand with a black hedge of bees on the front of it, and the whole thing was making a low sound like a room full of women praying. The child said, what is that? Wren said, that is what your mother had 8 of. She sat down on the grass and pulled the child down beside her, and she told her the custom, which is older than that house and older than the family in it. She said, when there is a death in a place, somebody must go out to the hives and knock, and tell them, in a plain voice, who has died. She said, if you do not tell them, they will go. They will die on their stand, or they will get up and leave and not come back. Because a hive is not a thing you keep, it is a household you are in, and a household that is not told the truth does not stay. She said, and when your mother died, this house did not tell the bees. She said, nobody knocked. They burned them instead. In the yard, all 8. Honor Ravensworth looked at the hive for a long time. Then she got up on her knees and she leaned forward and she knocked, twice on the straw, very carefully, with 2 fingers, the way you knock on a door when you are 6 and you are not sure you are allowed to be there. And she said, my mother is Elspeth, and she is dead. And the bees went on with what they were doing, which is the whole point of bees, and the child sat back on her heels and let out a breath that she had been holding since the 4th of June, 1869, and started to cry properly for the first time in a year and 8 months, with her face in her hands, sitting in wet grass in her second-best pinafore. The Duke of Thornwood was standing 40 yards down the path with his hat in his hand. He had been there since the child knocked. He did not come up and he did not go away, and after a while Wren looked down the path at him over the child's head, and he was crying too, standing in his own kitchen garden in front of his own gardeners at 8 in the morning, and neither of them said one word about it then, or for a long time afterwards. Gower came to her that night. She had been waiting for Gower since January. She had noticed at her first supper that the young footman ate nothing, and she had noticed by March that it was not nothing. It was sweet things, that he would take his tea black and would not touch the cook's seed cake, and would put his hand over the top of his cup when the sugar went round, and that a man of 26 who cannot look at a beekeeper's daughter is a man who has got a piece of something in his pocket he has been carrying so long it has worn a hole. She said, Mr. Gower, you were sick that morning. And Gower, 6'1", in his shirt, in the yard, with the hive humming faintly at the top of the garden in the dark, said, "O God," and sat down on the mounting block, and put his head in his hands. What Gower said, sitting on the mounting block, was this. The blue plate came back down to the pantry at about 10 o'clock, with the comb still in it, because the room had emptied in a hurry, and there was better than 2 spoonfuls left in the bottom, and he was 24 years old, and had been on his feet since 5, and had eaten a piece of bread at 4:30 in the morning, and he took it. He ate it standing up in the pantry with the door half shut, which is a dismissible offense in any great house in England, and was the only crime committed at Thornwood Manor on the 4th of June, 1869. Inside 20 minutes, his mouth was numb to the back of his teeth. Inside an hour, he was on the floor of the boot room, with his heart going so slow and so soft that he lay there certain he was dying, and could not stand up until 4 in the afternoon, and the house never missed him, because the house had a dead Duchess in it. He said, "I thought I would be taken up for it." He said, and by the evening they had all settled it was the honey, and the honey was Mr. Callister's, and I opened my mouth once in this yard to Mr. Frayne, and he told me that if I ever said out loud that I had eaten off her Grace's plate, I would go out of this house that night without a character, and be lucky not to be charged. And he was right, and I was 24, and I shut my mouth, and I have not eaten a sweet thing since. Wren sat down on the block beside him. She said, "Mr. Gower, you were not at that table." Gower said, "No," she said, "you had nothing at that breakfast but 2 spoonfuls of comb out of a plate. Not the ham, not the eggs, not the tea, not the room, not the shock, not the grief. The comb, and nothing else in the world." And Gower lifted his head very slowly out of his hands and looked at her, and she watched a young man understand that the thing he had been carrying in his pocket for 2 years as a shame was in fact the only clean proof in the county, and that he was going to have to stand up in front of 42 people and say it. He said, "Oh God." She said yes. Old Wilkin was the last piece and the easiest, because nobody had ever asked him anything in his life, and he had been waiting 60 years to be asked. He was 78, and he had been under Gardiner when the 4th Duke came back from Devon in the spring of 1851, with 300 bushes on 4 wagons, and he had put in every one of them himself, both sides of the South Drive, half a mile of it, with a boy carrying the water. He said the old Duke had them because Lord something or other at Alnwick had them, and they held the pheasants. He said they had never done a scrap of harm in 20 years. And Wren said, "Mr. Wilkin, do you keep a book?" And Wilkin, offended to the bone, said that he had kept a garden book every day since the year the young queen was crowned, and that there were 40 of them in the potting shed. And what did she think he was? She said, "Will you find me the 12th of May, 1869? He came back with it in 11 minutes, with his thumb in the page and his hands shaking, and he read it out to her in the doorway of the potting shed in the dark, in a voice that got smaller as it went, because he heard what he was reading about 2 lines before he finished it. 12th of May. Hard white frost at first light, 4 hours. Every blossom in the orchards taken, pear, plum, apple, all, hawthorn browned. Clover backward. Nothing for the bees but the drive. Nothing for the bees but the drive. He had written it himself in 1869, 3 weeks before the Duchess of Thornwood ate her own honey on her birthday, and he had put the book on a shelf and never thought about it again, because he was a gardener and it was a frost and frosts happen. Wilkin sat down on an upturned box in his own potting shed and said, "Oh, the poor man." He said it about Silas Callister. He was the first person in that parish in 2 years to say those 3 words in that order, and Wren stood in the doorway with the moths coming in past her head and did not trust herself to answer him. She had it all by the 1st of June. A dead man's rule, written every year for 7 years. A gardener's frost. A footman who had eaten nothing in the world but the comb, and had gone down like a felled tree, a duke's own numb mouth, and one thing more, which she had been growing on a stand at the top of the kitchen garden for 3 weeks, 200 yards from half a mile of the 4th Duke's purple, with the whole avenue in flower from the paddock to the lodge. On the 7th of June, she went up at 5 in the morning, and she took 1 comb out of that skep. New white wax, the size of her 2 hands, heavy, and the honey in it thin and pale with a green cast to it, and when she put the corner of it on her tongue, the tip of her tongue went to sleep inside 40 seconds. She stood in the dew and looked at it for a long moment, this pretty thing in her hands that had cost her father his name and his work and his life, and then she wrapped it in a cloth and put it in the tin. On the 8th, she walked to the vicarage and came back with a 2nd comb, cut in front of the Reverend Oakhurst out of his own orchard skep, 4 miles off, where there was not 1 bush of the purple in the whole parish, and he wrote the date on the cloth himself and signed it, because she asked him to, and because he was 70 years old and not slow. And he looked at her over his spectacles for a while and said, "My child, what are you going to do?" And Wren Callister said, "I am going to a party." The 9th of June, 1871. 42 to dinner, the shutters off the blue drawing room for the first time in 2 years, 1,100 candles, the chandelier down from Newcastle and up again, and every carriage in the county on the gravel by 8 o'clock. Wren Callister spent that evening where a still room maid spends an evening, which is in the still room, with her sleeves rolled up, doing the ices. The tin box was on the bench beside her with 2 cloths in it. At 9:30, the child was brought down to say good night, because the Countess of Marchmore had a theory about how a house comes back to life, and the theory required a small girl in a white dress on a staircase. And Honor Ravensworth came down the stairs in front of 42 people who had all known her mother, and stood at the bottom with her hand on the newel, and was asked by a kind old woman what she liked best in all the world, and said, into a room that had gone quiet to hear her, "The bees." She said, "We have got a hive at the top of the garden, and I knocked on it and told them about my mother." The room did not know what to do with that. And into the middle of it, the Countess of Marchmore, who had asked 3 questions in the passage that week and had got 3 answers, said, in a voice pitched for the whole room, "And who is it, my dear, who has been taking you up to Hives?" Society is very fast when it wants to be. It took perhaps 90 seconds. The name came out, and the name went round the room, and the room turned its whole face towards the Duke of Thornwood on his own staircase, and the Countess said, still pleasantly, that she thought the house should have the girl down. She said it as though she were asking for a fan. She said, "Let us see her. Let us all see the young woman who has got her father's hands on this child." That is how Wren Callister came into the blue drawing room at 20 minutes to 10 at night in a print dress and a wet apron, with her hair coming down and her forearms scalded pink to the elbow, carrying a tin box in front of the whole county. She had been ready since the 7th. Nobody in that room understood for another quarter of an hour that they had asked for it. She did not curtsy to the Countess. She went to the middle of the floor, and she put the tin box on the little table by the fire, and she said, in a still room maid's voice, quite level, that she would ask 3 things, and that if the room refused her, she would go out of the door and out of the house that night, and never say another word about it as long as she lived. She said, "I want Mr. Frayn's Daybook for June, 1869, off the shelf in the muniment room where it has been sitting for 2 years with nobody's hand on it. I want Dr. Merrick's watch out of his own pocket, and Dr. Merrick standing where he can see me. And I want 20 minutes of this room's patience, and after that, you may do what you like with me." The Duke of Thornwood came down 4 steps and said, "Give her whatever she asks for." The Countess said, Hallam, he did not look at her. He said, whatever she asks for, and it was the first order he had given in that room since the June before last, and the room heard it. She opened the tin. She took out 2 cloths and unwrapped them on the table, and there were 2 combs of new white wax side by side, and they were the same size and the same color, and any man in that room would have said they were cut off the same hive. She said, this one came out of the Reverend Oakhurst's orchard skep at Netherfold yesterday morning, 4 miles from this door. And he cut it himself and wrote the date on the cloth, and he is standing at the back of this room and can say so. And this one I cut at 5 o'clock on Wednesday morning out of a straw hive at the top of your own kitchen garden, 200 yards from the South Drive, in the first week of June, with 300 bushes of the 4th Duke's rhododendron in full flower the length of it. And now, Mr. Wilkin, who is 78 and who has been standing in that doorway for 10 minutes because I asked him to, is going to read what he wrote in his own garden book on the 12th of May, 1869. Old Wilkin read it in the middle of the blue drawing room with his hat in his hand and his thumb in the page. Hard white frost at first light, 4 hours. Every blossom in the orchard's taken. Pear, plum, apple, all hawthorn browned. Clover backward. Nothing for the bees but the drive. Nobody in the room moved. Wren said, my father cut the spring calm off the near row and burned it in the ash pit every June for 7 years, and this house called it waste. And it is written in his hand for every one of those years, and the books are in that box. And on the 2nd of June, 1869, with 3 weeks of pleurisy in him and a fortnight of his life left before he could stand up, he wrote, cannot rise, tell F. not to take the near row. She turned round. She said, Mr. Frayne, will you fetch your book? And there was a silence in that room of a kind that most of the people in it had never heard in their lives. Frayne stood by the door with his hands at his sides. He had 26 years in that house and a set of keys and every advantage a man can have in a corridor. He went and got the book himself. He was gone 4 minutes, and he came back with it under his arm. And he opened it on the little table by the fire, and he found the page without looking for it, because he had known exactly where it was for 2 years, and he read it out loud in his own voice. 3rd of June, 1869. 2 frames of comb, near row, for her Grace's birthday breakfast. Cut by me. Then he shut the book and said, I did not know. I have never known. He was crying. He said, he told me not to take it, and I thought he was an old fool who liked his own way, and I wanted the table to look well. Wren said, Thank you, Mr. Frayne, then, she said, and none of that is proof, and I know it is not, because a book can be wrong, and an old man's memory can be wrong, and a dead man's pencil can be called anything you like by anybody who wants to call it something. So I am going to give you the proof. Dr. Merrick, your watch. Take my wrist. Count it out loud so the room hears you. Merrick was 62 years old and had signed the certificate himself and had not slept well in 2 years, and he came across the floor and took her wrist and stood there in front of 42 people and said, 76. She picked up the near comb and she put a piece of it in her mouth about the size of a walnut, and she ate it. The room came off its chairs. The Duke of Thornwood said her name once in a voice nobody in that county had ever heard out of him, and started forward. And she put her hand up flat and stopped a duke in the middle of his own drawing room. She said, 20 minutes. Then she said, Mr. Gower, and the footman who had been standing against the wall by the door all evening with a tray in his hands came out into the light and put the tray down on a chair and told 42 people that on the 4th of June, 1869, he had eaten 2 spoonfuls of comb out of her Grace's plate in the pantry and nothing else. No ham, no eggs, no tea, and that he had been on the boot room floor by 11 with his mouth dead and his heart going like a clock running down, and that he had told Mr. Frayne, and Mr. Frayne had told him what it would cost him, and that he was ashamed, and that he was saying it now. And Merrick, holding the wrist, said, 61. It went on like that. It went on for a quarter of an hour in a room full of the best people in the county, all standing, nobody speaking. An old physician calling a number every 2 minutes into the silence with his watch in his other hand, while a still room maid stood in the middle of the floor and went the color of a wet sheet. 58. 54. She said, "Doctor, my tongue is numb to the back of the teeth." And he said, "I know." And his voice had gone. 50. She put her hand out and found the table without looking at it. 49. 46. And Dr. Merrick let go of her wrist and stood up straight in front of the county and said, "Xenophon." He said it to the ceiling, like a man being told the answer to something he had been sitting an examination on for 2 years. He said, "The 10,000. On the march to the sea they came down to Trebizond, and they found the wild hives, and the whole army ate the comb and went out of their senses, and lay on the ground like a beaten army, and every one of them was up in 3 days. And there is not a physician in England who has not read it at school and laughed at it." He said, "It is the flower. It is in the flower." He said, "And in a bad spring, with the frost on the blossom and nothing else open for a mile, that comb would be 9 parts of the one flower and not 1 part in 10 of anything else." And then he stopped, because he had got that, he said, and it would not trouble a strong man above a day. And he turned and looked at the Duke of Thornwood, and he said, "But she had the rheumatic fever when she was 11 years old, Hallam. I told you myself her heart was a poor engine. I have written it in her own casebook, and there was nothing whatever wrong with her heart on the 3rd of June except what I had known about it since she was a child." That is when the Duke said it. He said it into a silent room, standing on the 4th step of his own staircase, without being asked. He said, "My mouth went numb." He said, "I ate it too. My mouth went numb for 2 hours, and I have thought for 19 months that it was fear." He came down the last 4 steps, and he stood in the middle of that room, and he said, "I signed a paper on the 6th of June, 1869, dismissing a man without a character, and I burned his bees in my own yard where he could see it. And I let this county call him what it called him for 2 years, and I never once opened a book. And there are 5 books in this house that would have told me, and every one of them was written by somebody who is standing in this room." He looked at Wren Callister. She was holding the table with both hands by then and could not stand up straight. He said, "And I have not paid for it, and neither has anyone else, and she has paid twice." Wren said no, she said it to the room, not to him. She said, "You have all been very good about the bees. You burned them because you were grieving, and everyone told you it was a mercy, and nobody in this county has said his name in 2 years because it was easier not to, and I understand it. I do. But you do not tell the bees for the bees' sake. You tell them because the truth is owed, and a house that will not pay what it owes is not a home. It is a very fine building with the clock's wound." Then she was sick on the floor of the blue drawing room in front of 42 people, and the Duke of Thornwood went down on his knees in the middle of it and got her head onto his arm. And Lady Adeline Sedge, who was going to be engaged that night and knew by then that she was not, was on the carpet on the other side of her, with her own gloves off and her hand under the girl's neck, saying, "Get the doctor, get him here, and somebody bring a cushion." And to her mother, without looking up, in a voice that had 400 years in it, "Be quiet." She was up by the following afternoon, exactly as Merrick had said she would be, sitting against the pillows in a bedroom on the first floor that no still room maid had ever been carried into, eating dry toast with her fingers and being extremely rude to a duke about the state of her copper. He had not been out of the chair since 2 in the morning. Dr. Merrick wrote 3 letters that week, one to the registrar at Alnwick, one to the county paper, and one to a medical man in London he had been at Edinburgh with, and by the end of July there was a paragraph in a journal about poisonous honey in the north of England, with a frost date in it, and a gardener's book cited, and the name of a bee master spelled correctly. He came up to the house himself and read it out loud in the servants' hall, standing, to 14 people, because he said that was where it had happened and that was where it would be undone. Frayne gave in his notice on the 11th of June, and the Duke refused it, and then took it 3 days later when the man asked a second time, and wrote him a character in his own hand that told the truth about all of it. The 26 years and the 2 frames of comb and the 2 years of silence, and let the man choose whether to show it. He went to his sister at Berwick and keeps 2 skeps in her garden now, and once a year, in June, a parcel of candles comes to the kitchen door, with no letter in it. Nance gave notice in July before anybody could ask her to, and went to a place in Durham and told the story there for years with herself in a different part of it. The Countess of Marchmore was in her carriage by 11 the next morning, and did not come into that county for 2 years, and then came and was received and behaved beautifully, because she was not a wicked woman. She was a woman who had been very certain. Lady Adeline Sedge came back in August of her own accord and sat in the kitchen garden for an hour and a half and said, "I was wrong about you, and I was wrong out loud, which is the worst kind, and I should like to be right out loud in the same rooms." And she was, all that autumn, in every drawing room in the north, and it cost her something, and she paid it. She was at the wedding. That October the 4th Duke's Purple Avenue came out of the ground. 300 bushes, half a mile of it, out with chains and horses over 9 days, and they burned the lot in the stable yard in the same corner where the Hives had burned. And the whole household came out to watch it, and old Wilkin, 78, stood at the front with his arms folded and did not say one word for 2 hours. They put limes in, 200 of them, both sides, small as walking sticks, and it will be 40 years before they are anything at all. And every June from now until the house falls down, they will hang over that drive and pour nectar on it, and there is not a bee in England that has ever come to harm on a lime. The hive row went back on its stands, 8 of them, white, on the bare black rectangles, and the bee house had a new roof by McElmus and her father's apron on the peg where he left it. Bram came home from the lime kiln at Hexwell in October, 11 years old and small for it, and slept in the room over the scullery. And by the following June he could take a swarm off a branch with his bare hands, and his sister stood 40 yards off and let him do it. The paper of the 6th of June, 1869, the dismissal without a character, in a duke's own hand, came out of the muniment room, and Hallam Ravensworth burned it himself in the bee-house stove, with Wren standing beside him. And then he sat down at his own dining table and wrote out a character for a man who had been dead a year and 8 months, and it is framed in the bee house, and every man who works on that estate has read it. He asked her in the bee house in November with the frost on. She said the county would say she was beneath him. He said the county had said a great many things and had been wrong about all of them for 2 years, and he did not propose to take its advice now. She said, "I am a beekeeper's daughter." And the Duke of Thornwood said, "Yes, and my wife is alive in my child's mouth because of it, and I have got a whole house that is a home again, because a girl in a wet apron would not be quiet. And if you tell me one more time what you are, I shall have to be extremely rude to you." They were married in the parish church on the 11th of March, 1872, by the Reverend Oakhurst, who was 71 and had buried her father for nothing, and the church would not hold the people who came. Honor Ravensworth, 7 years old, walked in front with a straw skep in her arms, empty, because it was March and no swarm would come for 2 months, and she carried it the whole way like a chalice. And on the morning of the wedding, before any of them, before the bells, Wren Callister went up the kitchen garden in the half-dark on her own and knocked twice on the second hive and told the bees in a plain voice that there was to be a wedding in the house, because it is not only the deaths you tell them, it is everything. That is the custom. If you have got this far, you have been standing in that drawing room with the rest of them. So let me ask you the thing I have been turning over since I found the frost book. This house was not saved by the truth. The truth was in 5 books on 5 shelves in that house for 2 years, and it saved nobody. So tell me what you think actually did it. The girl who ate the comb in front of 42 people, or the 6-year-old who knocked on a straw hive and said her mother's name out loud first? Tell me which one you would have been in that room. The one who speaks, or the one who waits to be asked? Because I think most of us know, and I would like to hear it from you. Tell me where you are watching from as well, and what the weather is doing there, because I ask everyone and I read all of them. Next time I will tell you what came out of that hive the following summer, and what a boy of 12 did with it, and why the county came back up that drive with their hats off a second time. And now, if you will, one more picture before you go. A stone bee house at the top of a walled garden, a little after 6 in the morning in June. A woman in a straw hat with no veil on, which somebody would have told her off for. A small girl on the grass with her chin on her knees, 8 white hives in a row on bare black ground, and the sun coming over the wall and every one of them roaring.